It's no surprise that the climate crisis is upon us. As one of the most pressing issues of our generation, climate change affects everyone, both human and non-human beings alike. And the effects of climate change are disproportionately felt across different communities. In coastal towns and cities, the effects of habitat loss, sea level rise, and changes to fisheries are experienced by people every single day. And while the ocean is often out of sight, out of mind, even within coastal cities, it's actually the main climate stabilizer of the planet and hugely important to billions of people for food, recreation, cultural and spiritual connection, and is the basis of entire economies. In this first episode of the Banfield Marine Science Center Climate Action Series, we'll introduce you to the people, land, and water of the Huu-ay-aht First Nation territory and get the lowdown on the science behind climate change and how you can be empowered to take climate action in your own community. Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today and welcome to the Banfield Marine Science Center Climate Action Series webinar. My name is Aneri and I'll be your host for this series. I'm coming to you today from the Banfield Marine Sciences Center in the traditional territory of the Huu-ay-aht First Nation, and I'm so excited to introduce you to this new series focusing on the causes, impacts, and solutions of the climate crisis to coastal communities, and the actions we can take towards a more livable planet. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we cannot talk about climate action without considering the ongoing colonialism that perpetuates climate inequities. The Indigenous land and water protectors that have been engaging in climate action for generations often face the strongest effects of climate change. Banfield Marine Science Center has a responsibility towards the Huu-ay-aht First Nation whose traditional territories we're on, and to acknowledge the other nations within Barkley Sound where we do our research, including the Sayshat, Tokwat, Uslilithot, and Uchuclisset nations. As a newcomer and settler to this territory, I appreciate the chance to learn more about the Huu-ay-aht Nation and their values. And I encourage you at home or work, wherever you are, to take a moment to consider, where are you? Whose traditional treaty or unceded Indigenous lands do you dwell upon? What do you know about the histories of that place and the people of those nations? And how do you relate to the lands and waters in that nation? Consider this your first and ongoing climate action recommendation. While territorial acknowledgements are steps towards decolonization, we encourage you to take some time to familiarize yourself with where you are and the significance of that place. I'm a marine ecologist and climate justice advocate. Through my research and community work, I've had the privilege of meeting some amazing ecosystems and peoples across the coasts of this land many of us call Canada. I've seen firsthand how climate change affects diverse ecosystems and organisms, from changes within the very cells of Arctic algae to widespread pest infestations in eastern red spruce forests. And here on the West Coast, ecosystem changes are impacting culturally important fisheries, watershed health, terrestrial and marine forests, and all the people that are interdependent within these ecosystems. And honestly, it's scary. The climate crisis can feel like this huge and impossible challenge, especially when we now know that the window of opportunity to act quickly and boldly grows narrower each year. What I have to tell myself in these moments when I feel totally overwhelmed is that my feelings are actually really powerful. They're telling me I need to educate myself on what's going on to feel empowered, and then channel those feelings of fear and anxiety into positive action. The goal of this series is to build our collective knowledge through interactive educational webinars so you can feel empowered and inspired to take action wherever you are. Here at the Bamfield Marine Science Center, we have the opportunity to share some of the cutting-edge research and discoveries in ocean and coastal science, and to partner with experts at the Huu-ay-aht First Nation and Ocean Networks Canada to teach you about the diverse ecosystems we live in. We'll aim to encompass the multifaceted impacts of climate change, including the people that are impacted economically, socially, and ecologically by ecosystem changes, and the potential of ocean climate solutions. The climate crisis is intrinsically linked to broader social crises, which means ecological solutions must also consider social solutions, like creating good training opportunities and jobs, decolonization, sustainable food and health systems, anti-racism work, and reinvesting in critical infrastructure. Fortunately, transformational change isn't radical. It's aligned with what the science tells us and benefits people. So we're here to help introduce you to how this is being done in coastal communities and inspire you to think about what you're passionate about in the climate solutions movement. We also want to remind you that climate action isn't something you have to do alone, nor do you have to quit your job and become a full-time activist to engage with it. We need everyone and all their skills to win this race. So it doesn't matter if you're a scientist, baker, nurse, teacher, or construction worker. We all bring something to the table that can help out. Climate action can be as simple as challenging yourself to learn something new about the climate crisis every day. Or join a local advocacy group so you can act together. Believe me, it's way less isolating and can even be fun to engage in climate action with other like-minded people that just want to make the world a little better. With that, thanks so much for joining us today, and let's dive into the first portion of today's webinar. Thanks for tuning in, everyone, and welcome. It's my honor to start today by introducing the head hereditary chief of the Huu-ay-aht First Nation, Sequestration, English name Derek Peters. Sequestration was born and raised in Huu-ay-aht First Nation traditional territory. His past work with the Huu-ay-aht First Nation spans working in forest management and engineering, multiple terms on elected council, and involvement in negotiating the Monmouth Modern Treaty with the BC Treaty Commission, where he served on the Huu-ay-aht First Nations communications team. Since 2008, Sequestration took on the responsibility of Tai Hatwilth, or in English, head hereditary chief, and now represents the nation's traditional interest to protect and take care of present and future generations. His main role is to look out for the well-being of all Huu-ay-aht First Nation citizens, the land, resources, and culture, while respecting the motto of Ancient Spirit, Modern Mind. This is done in part by respecting the three sacred principles, and we thank him in joining us today for a territorial acknowledgement to center us to this place. Sequestration, please go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Certainly is an honor, and I'm so happy to be here to start this conversation off. That was a great video too, by the way. Definitely is a conversation that needs to happen, and certainly support the conversation in all professions that are in this circle. So with that, yes, my name is Derek Peters. Sequestration is the traditional name I carry for the Huu-ay-aht Nation, as head chief responsible for carrying out the values that was mentioned. And the three values are, first one is Hishuk Masawak, which means everything is one. Second value is Isok, which means respect, and Uothuk, which means taking care of. Those are our three, governing principles and laws, and that we follow under our tradition, and it's something that we've never ever went away from. And so, what that means is, some people may be wondering, what does head responsibility mean? What does that head chief responsibility entail? Well, it entails being led by these values. My responsibility is to my people. The population of the Huu-ay-aht Nation is 580. 85% of our people live away from the homelands. My responsibility is to that large family of mine, to ensure that we carry out all traditions and culture that we're responsible for. There's also 7 hereditary chiefs in total. There's 6 more hereditary leaders I work with. We meet on a monthly basis, and everything is led by these 3 values. And what those 3 values, I guess, in translation mean is it's designed to take only what we need so we can have resources forever, because we're dependent 100% on our resources, sea and land. So that those 3 values, ensure that we're connected, land and sea, Hishik Masawak, everything is one. So recognizing that we can't do anything in one area of the territory without considering, what impacts may happen to other areas. So that's something that's very, very strongly built into us as a people. We signed a treaty in 2011. Although we're structured in a way where it's spelt out into our constitution that we have a hereditary system as well that needs to be acknowledged, we've always operated that way. So it wasn't new for us. Although it was spelt out in black and white in our own constitution, but that's just how we've been passed on by teachings from generation after generation. So those are strong values that are built into the White people today, and everything we do in terms of management, creating partnerships, they all have to align with these 3 values that we have so much pride in. So I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to introduce the conversation, and recognizing the Marine Science Center plays a huge role in the Barkley Sound area, and we support all efforts and work that are being led by the Marine Science Center. And I'm happy to be here, and wish you all well in your conversations, and have a great day. Choo.
I just wanted to say thank you. As a newcomer, I always appreciate the chance to learn more about the Hawaiian values, and it's interesting how these values, we might have different language for them, for example, a different vocabulary in the sciences with everything is one, but they're all at their root the same. So thank you. Yeah, we appreciate having you here today. It's my pleasure to introduce to you our second guest, Dr. Kate Moran, CEO and President of Ocean Networks Canada. Her previous work included leading the first deepwater drilling operation in the Arctic to recover the first Arctic paleoclimate records, professor and associate dean at the University of Rhode Island in the Graduate School of Oceanography and Department of Ocean Engineering, and as director of the International Ocean Drilling Program in Washington, D.C., where she designed oceanographic tools, participated in more than 40 offshore expeditions, and served as chair on multiple international science and engineering advisory committees. That's just a brief list of her accomplishments. She's also highly involved in public outreach, so we're so excited to have her here today to give us the lowdown on climate science. All right, Dr. Moran, go ahead and feel free to share your screen right now and unmute yourself.
Oh, great. Thank you. And I just wanted to start off by letting others know that I'm speaking here from the traditional territories of the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and the Saanich peoples. And so I'll just start my presentation. Yeah, thank you for inviting me, and it's really an honor to be the first speaker at this new series. It's a very important series, and my presentation is rooted in some of my background. As it was mentioned, I led an expedition to understand past climate from the Arctic Ocean. So I'm going to talk about lessons from deep time, and of course we also work to have lessons from the Indigenous peoples, because they also are part of understanding climate change as we go forward. So let me first start about Ocean Networks Canada. We monitor everything about the ocean, from the water, the life, the interaction with the continents, but also because we're on the West Coast and there's earthquakes, we also try to understand the spreading center and subduction zones and earthquakes and tsunamis. So almost everything that happens in the ocean, we actually monitor and provide data for scientific researchers, and also using the data to help policymakers and coastal communities understand their own world. And so we operate these telecommunication cables that provide real-time data 24/7. We operate now over 88,000 sensor systems that deliver data openly and freely over the internet. We're offshore the west coast of Vancouver Island in the Salish Sea. And because we have a very robust data management system that is open to the public, we now are delivering data from many other parts of the country. And we're proud to be operating coastal community observatories on behalf of and in partnership with Indigenous communities, First Nations in BC, Inuit in the Arctic, and now we've started to work with other Indigenous communities on the East Coast. This is just a short video just to see the environment. This is a node that provides power and internet connectivity to the sensors at the bottom of the ocean. And this is one of the most dynamic environments that we monitor, the Endeavour segment of the Juan de Fuca Ridge. Black smokers, 320 degrees seawater, life that comes from chemosynthesis. So it's an incredible offshore area that we have off of Canada's coastline. So that was us. I just wanted to quickly tell you about Ocean Race Canada. But let me start off by giving you some background on climate change and the greenhouse effect. As you probably all are aware, it's our atmosphere that in normal CO2, carbon dioxide times, we would have a balance between the incoming and outcoming heat. But as we increase greenhouse gases, that heat gets trapped, and hence we have a warming world. Then the gases that are important are methane, nitrous oxide, water vapor, and of course, carbon dioxide. But what you should notice is that the water vapor comes and goes, so it plays a role in climate impact, as you know, because of flooding. Methane is the most powerful greenhouse gas, but its lifetime in the atmosphere is shorter, 12 years. And carbon dioxide has a very, very long lifetime in the atmosphere, and hence that's one of the reasons we're so concerned about carbon dioxide emissions. And the third is the nitrous oxide, which is a small part of the greenhouse gas portfolio. But it started with physics. Samuel Langley was a physicist, and he invented a bolometer that measures far infrared radiation. And he was able to use that in the late 1800s to actually measure the solar energy coming into the Earth. That was the beginning. And then others became interested. So then more were interested. Svante Arrhenius used Langley's work to estimate atmospheric cooling for future CO2 decreases. So he was worried that there might be more ice ages that would be coming along. But he also did the reverse. He also calculated that if we doubled CO2 in the atmosphere, first, if we halved it, it would create an ice age. But if we doubled it, it would increase warming of the planet 4 to 6 degrees Celsius. This was in the late 1800s. So we already knew it back then. And it was also in the news. So in early days, this greenhouse effect was well known, and its impact, that potential impact, was well known. And of course, more recently, in the latter part of the last century, James Hansen testified to the US Congress and really showed data that from his models that became pretty reliable. So he was actually right in terms of what kind of temperatures we would be seeing. And those models have proven to be pretty reliable as we go forward. So what we've noted quite a while. Now, another scientist, Charles Keeling, started measuring in the 50s, I think it was the early 50s, the actual concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And this was one of his first publications. And you can see a zigzag CO2 up and down, up and down. And those measurements have continued to this day. And I downloaded this from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography website, where we're measuring carbon dioxide in the atmosphere all the time. And that zigzag that Charles Keeling measured in the beginning continues to this day. And it's just because of the way that land on the planet works. There's more land in the Northern Hemisphere. So in the summertime, the trees pull down a little bit more CO2 than when it's summertime in the Southern Hemisphere. But overall, that increase has continued and is marching along. And we still, as a species, have not started to reduce our CO2 emissions, unfortunately. So I'll turn now to climate forcing. What forces are, what actually changes our climate? And oops, the first one, let me just back up. So we have several forcing mechanisms. Astronomical cycles, the way that the Earth travels in its path around the sun. Volcanic events, tectonics, and us, of course. And so let's start with astronomical events. It started with Milankovitch, an astronomer. He calculated the variations in the Earth's orbital shapes and their frequencies, how they changed over time. And that changed the amount of solar radiation coming onto the planet. And it proved to be stable for millions of years from paleo data that I'll talk about later. But basically the parameters of the eccentricity of the path, the actual tilt of the axis, and then the wobble of the axis. And all of those together, depending on how they change the incoming solar radiation. And so this is, I won't show you too many graphs, but this is over time, over about 100,000 years, showing you that, that you have variations in those three parameters: precession, obliquity, and eccentricity. If you put them all together, you actually can calculate the solar forcing, and you can see it varies. And what's important to see is that during the ice ages, when there was low solar forcing, you actually had ice ages. You had continental ice on the continents. And when there was high solar forcing, you actually had an interglacier or no ice on the planet. So this is a really important forcing mechanism that was consistent with what Arrhenius had talked about, or had discovered earlier. Volcanoes are also a part of the climate forcing. They're short-lived in terms of their impact, but big volcanic eruptions can change the planet in terms of temperature. So these are showing you over about a little over a century that these big volcanic eruptions, they reduce the temperature, average temperature of the planet after each one of them, because they provided a temporary blanket that kept solar energy from coming into the atmosphere and heating it. In terms of tectonics, it's called orogeny or mountain building. So one of the biggest influences on the climate system was the uplift of the Himalayas over a long period of time. These are long periods of time whereby there's mountain uplift, there's steep slopes, mass wasting, and they have increased rock fragmentation that then chemically react, mostly with ocean water, pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere, and that creates over the long term global cooling. Now, the biggest one that's happening today is us, of course, and this is just a diagram that shows you that we are making a major impact on the climate system by our transportation, our use of electricity and heating our buildings and agriculture, et cetera. So we are actually an important part of the climate forcing, and so much so that scientists are now calling the time we're in the Anthropocene, the time of man. So let me just step back and talk a little bit about paleoclimate and what we call is paleoclimatology, and we use tools. We use, I don't personally use tree rings, but scientists use tree rings to reconstruct temperature over thousands of years, not longer than that, over thousands of years. Other scientists recover ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica and extract the bubbles and can measure the actual CO2 in the atmosphere and other proxies to reconstruct temperature. And that's over tens to hundreds of thousands of years. And then I've worked on recovering sediment cores from the bottom of the ocean that go back hundreds of thousands of years. And you can stack these all together to get a temperature and a climate record of the Earth going back hundreds and millions of years. And it's in the sediment cores, these are small fossils that have calcareous shells. Some of them have silica shells, some have calcareous, and the isotopes of these shells are representative of the temperature and oxygen levels and CO2 of the planet. That's how it can be interpreted. And so I said I won't use too many graphs, but this is one that on the y-axis, we're going back in time. The top is from today, going back 60 million years ago plus. And this is work from James Zackos from the University of California. He pulled together all of the temperature data from these shells and reconstructed the temperature of the average temperature of the planet. And so what you can see is that there was a time when the Earth was quite a bit warmer than today, but over time it changed as, for example, the tectonic processes caused cooling of the planet. And when you look at on the right is a blow up of just a few millions of years ago. And what you're seeing here is that at some point during the time when the solar orbital parameters reduced the solar input, it kicked the Earth into a glacial and interglacial cycle that was again driven by those Mitigation cycles. So these forcings interacted in various ways over time. I'm going to come back to that. But just the bottom line here is that if we pulled 100 parts per million CO2 out of the atmosphere, it could trigger an ice age, and then we might have 4 kilometers of ice sitting on top of us. That's how sensitive the Earth is to the CO2. That's why a lot of scientists call it, the CO2 is the dial that drives the temperature on our planet. So I co-led an expedition to the Central Arctic Ocean. This is a map of the Arctic Ocean, and we drilled very close to the North Pole to recover a sediment record, a paleoclimate record that I talked about. And before that, we had to analyze it by acoustics. This is a cross-section of the ridge that we drilled on. And you can see it looks like a layer cake, like a birthday cake of layers. And those layers represent past time and record those fossils and other proxies in that. So we were able to go to this location, and our goal was to take that record I showed you of the compilation of the temperature on the planet and uncover it for the Arctic Ocean, because there had been no paleoclimate before that for the Arctic Ocean. So there was no record older than 1.5 million years in the Arctic before this expedition. And we also wanted to understand what scientists called the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, or what I call the big heat. It was a time in the record where we know that the planet had an extreme thermal event, extreme heating. Some people think it's analogous to what we're doing as humans to the planet today. So we used 3 icebreakers. It was a pretty hard thing to do because there was ice there. We had an icebreaker that broke the ice, crushed it up into tiny cubes, and then kept a drill ship on location because we had to stay there for weeks at a time to drill hundreds of meters below the sea floor in deep water. I'm not going to describe this diagram. Just think of it as the top of the diagram is the seafloor, and then the bottom of the diagram is several hundred meters beneath the seafloor. And it's just a picture that we use in a scientific publication. But let me explain what we discovered. So we discovered that their sea ice record in the Arctic Ocean goes back like 15 million years and longer. We also discovered that the perennial sea ice has been there for 15 million years, which means that what we're doing today, where sea ice is going away, we might be losing in 35 years climate systems that's been around for over 15 million years. We discovered that this ice started very early, and that scientifically was very important. We also discovered the Arctic Ocean did something really important. It was covered in duckweed, azolla, and that allowed it to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere very fast. And we think this is one of the responsive mechanisms of the Earth during times of increased carbon dioxide. And this was all over the Arctic Ocean and in subarctic basins. But most importantly, the big heat. We learned that during the big heat in the Arctic Ocean, the surface temperature was 24 degrees C. Modelers had said that it would have been like 15 degrees C. And it was a kind of aha moment, because what we're seeing today as we warm the planet during what we're doing is another big heat, that the heating is more concentrated in the poles, in the North Pole area and the South Pole area. So this response of the planet to this warming is what's happening today. Now, this is one of the graphs that I want to just make sure you understand. The blue diagram is a diagram of time. So x-axis is time, 20,000 years. And it's showing you that even that big heat event, that is a sharp blip on that record I showed you, a sharp increase in temperature, it actually occurred over 20,000 years. The red is what we're doing. So the rate at which we're putting CO2 into the atmosphere is so much faster than even during that extreme event in the geologic record. Now, that extreme event, 20,000, that happened 65 million years ago or so, actually caused mass extinction. And so we have to be cognizant of the fact that we as humans are being a bigger climate forcing enterprise than almost ever before. So simply put, we are basically have 3 choices: mitigation, adaptation, and suffering. We're going to do some of each. We already have done mostly suffering. The question is, what is the mix going to be? And the more we mitigate, that means reduce emissions, the less we have to adapt, and the less suffering. And I think we need to keep this simple message clear to everyone who wants to help make the planet a place that is habitable for humans and the creatures that we so treasure. So I'll talk about mitigate. This is a stylized diagram from the UN Environment Program. And on the x-axis is years. So it goes out from 2010 and to 2100. And it's showing you our current emissions. On the y-axis is the billions of tons of CO2 emitted per year. And we made this last year, hoping we would start having drastic reductions. We haven't yet. I got to change that to 2021. But what it's saying in that light gray area past 2038, it means that no matter how fast we reduce emissions, we're going to have to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere in order to keep the planet habitable for us. And so that's one of the work projects that Ocean Networks Canada is leading. We're trying to bring together a negative, what we call negative emissions, pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere together by using direct air capture technology that's developed here in BC by Carbon Engineering, taking that direct capture CO2 on a renewably powered platform of some kind in the ocean, pump the CO2 through the water column into the subsea floor, where we inject it into the rock, specifically in basalt. That's ocean crust. I showed you that video in the beginning of the black smokers. That's the kind of environment where new ocean crust is being formed, basalt. And Iceland scientists and technologists determined that when they injected CO2 into basalt in Iceland, which is it's one of the only places where this kind of basalt is above the sea level, it turned into rock in 2 years. So this will take a while to put together, but it will be important technology at a time when we have to be sure that we start pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. This is a bit of a detailed diagram, but we have a project timeline. Sorry, that we started in 2017 with big international partners. We have funding on a feasibility study right now, and we hope to have results of that study in less than 2 years. In terms of adaptation, that means how do we change the way we live in our environment as it changes? And so where is the heat going? We know that the planet's warming up, but 93.4% of the heat that's generated from our burning of fossil fuels is going into the ocean. And so if we didn't have the ocean, we would already be in deep, deep trouble as a species. And we saw the results of that from the 2014, 2015 time period, where there was what the scientists call the blob, a very big warming in the Central Pacific, and that impacted the coastal environment. And you can see from satellite data on the left is just a kind of a normal El Nino year where there's warming in the equatorial Pacific. And then in 2015, you can see in addition, there was a big warming off our coast. And what we saw locally at Folger, just near Bamfield, was the fact that local waters impacted by that big heat increased by almost 2 degrees C, which has great impact on the species that live in our waters. And when water is warmer, it has less nutrients. So some speculate that time period several years ago now has been impacting the actual the salmon returns. And we're seeing these happen more and more, marine heat waves. So we need to understand them. We need to understand how can we adapt and protect some of the species. And then just a few weeks ago, we know that that heat dome that happened because of climate change, that impacted the coastal environment, likely in Bamfield and other places. And we need to understand how can we protect these coastal species from this kind of extreme heat event. Sea level is also something that we have to worry about, not necessarily right here in our location because of our tectonic environment, but certainly Boundary Bay in BC, Tuktoyaktuk in northern Canada, and of course, much of Atlantic Canada is impacted by sea level rise. And I just drew these lines on here showing you that there's an increase in the acceleration of the sea level rise. And what we're seeing now is the contributors of sea level. It used to just be the fact that the ocean was warming, which makes the ocean water expand. That was the biggest contributor. And now we know that the biggest contributor now is coming from the loss of ice from Greenland and Antarctica. This is just a paper that was published last year, showing you that there is, on all those red lines are showing you it's loss of ice. There's no increase in snowfall that increases the ice on the planet, on those continents any longer. So as sea level rise, we have to start making decisions. How do we protect it, abandon, or retreat? And we are in that stage in those areas that are at high risk. How do we adapt in order to keep our coastal communities strong? So these are really going to be hard questions to answer. The other adaptation that's important, particularly for our coast, Ocean Networks Canada works on all of these kind of climate adaptation solutions, but I'll just give you another example of ocean acidification. Everyone talks about plastic in the ocean, which is important to reduce, but it's really a problem that can be solved by reducing plastic use. But ocean acidification is really the worst issue we have. It's because the CO2 that's absorbed by the ocean, it makes changes the chemistry of the ocean and makes the ocean more acidic. And those shells that you see here in the top part of the diagram are calcareous shells. Those are the fossils I showed you earlier that record the temperature of the planet after they die. They are corrosive to acidic water, and they're at the base of the food web. And so we have to figure out how we can help and protect the food web under an increasing regime of ocean acidification. So we've installed a pH monitoring station in Bain Sound near the shellfish aquaculture locations on Vancouver Island, one of the biggest aquaculture sites in the province. And it's real-time data, and we're just beginning to engage. We want to engage with the shellfish aquaculture farmers so that we can provide them data if they need it to understand their own changing environment. And that is to help them continue to farm these beautiful oysters. And of course, it's trying to help scientists understand how we can also protect the food web so that we can have this beautiful ecosystem. So that's just an example of adaptation. There are others, but that's just because of time. I just want to talk about that. And of course, suffer. That's the third part. And we know these publications are already showing us that people are dying from heat, for example, and other, hurricanes, of course, and other kind of extreme events. And now we're seeing many more fires. So this is all part of, we need to act and reduce the suffering by mitigation and adaptation. And of course, we are already seeing this in almost every part of the world. It's not just in Canada. And as was described earlier, it really does impact those the countries that have less resources than we do. And so we need to really be generous about how we share our knowledge and help other countries adapt and mitigate climate change. So here's some takeaways from my presentation. We've known about greenhouse effect for a very long time. It's not new, and there should be no argument about it because it's been around a long time. And in fact, the predictions from the 1880s were correct. So that's something that you can share with any doubters that you know. There's several things that force the climate, but now humans are really now becoming the largest force. And the paleoclimate record I showed you shows that the human forcing of today is faster than even the most extreme events that cause extinctions in the geologic record. So just to summarize again, we have three choices: mitigate, adapt, and I hope we can reduce the suffering. And I'm there to work on these things so that we can do that. You can take individual actions to do something for yourself. This is just a simple diagram to show what you can do and try to do more of each of these. And of course, be sure to, whoever you're voting at, whatever level of government, that they are climate knowledgeable politicians, and then vote for those that are climate knowledgeable and ready to invoke policy and legislation to move us in the right direction. So thank you for your attention, and I understand there might be Q&A, so I'll stop there. Thanks.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Dr. Moran. That was a whirlwind. We got lessons on everything from paleoclimate to future climate to present, and a lot of material. And one thing I noticed was really, I like that you mentioned this and that it connected with what Felician was talking about who are we responsible to? And I appreciate you mentioning that about, who are the largest carbon emitters and who are we responsible to in terms of sharing our generosity and knowledge. So that was a really excellent point. Thank you. And does anyone from the audience have a question? Please go ahead and input it in the Q&A box. And if you need a sec just to think about it, I have a question for you, Dr. Moran. Obviously, a lot of what you shared with us today is sobering, but it's also a reality. And you've worked in many fields, from science to policy, education. How do you stay motivated or grounded in your work?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think about the paleoclimate event that I just talked about, that we learned more about in terms of how the Arctic was impacted by that extreme event, the big heat. And there were no humans on the planet there then. And here we are. And so it might be that we're acting stupid right this minute, but we have the ability to not act stupidly. And so I remain positive because of the fact that we're here seeing it, and we certainly can do something about it.
I might have to quote you on that. We have the ability to not act stupidly.
Yes.
I was also curious, in your experience with outreach and education, what do you think is the biggest misconception about climate science, especially in the age of, well, I read it on Facebook, so I'm a climate expert now? And
Well,
how do you approach that?
Yeah, I think it's really important for scientists to speak from their heart. To talk about how it bothers them, how they're worried about their family, because it's humanizing the people who are conducting the science. And when people have an emotional connection to you and they begin to trust you because you're showing your inner warts, then that ability to accept this knowledge becomes greater. So I think we have to do more and more of having scientists not just present the data, but present how they feel about it, because most scientists have families and kids, and some now have grandkids, and they hope their kids have great grandkids. And I also think that it's important for us to work closely with our indigenous communities, because their outlook is really 7 generations. And so when you put it in the context of that, it becomes very powerful. It's for, and as was said right in the beginning by the chief of the Indigenous group, that it's really about ensuring that we have the resources for future generations and don't overuse. And so I think those messages are very powerful too.
Yeah, that's so true. And it's really interesting, even in my brief time learning as a scientist, how the narrative has even changed of like, oh, if you're a scientist and you speak about climate change, people might take you less seriously. But it's true, we're all people, we all live in this world, and that's the reality of needing to also have that action happen in a timely manner. What do you think in terms of Ocean Networks Canada? Really awesome description of the carbon capture and description of, mitigation is their number one priority, but this is a technology worth investing and researching in. So what do you think is the greatest challenge to that, or potential solutions in that research?
Well, the biggest challenge right now is the reality is that the technology that we're proposing to put together exists. And it has been much of it, well, except for carbon engineering, which is very unique. And BC is this carbon engineering is one of the leading companies in the world. A lot of the other technology is from the extractive industries. And so they're just starting to turn the corner and begin to change their business models to be, okay, we've got to start being sustainable, and we've got to start working on this problem. So it's really getting those, frankly, it's mostly men in boardrooms, to change those business models and help us advance these technologies, because they've developed it for other purposes that have been part of the problem.
Totally, yeah, and that seems responsible to me, that if you're part of that problem, you also have to be part of the solution.
And I do think, it's really great to see that Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada has a 50-30 challenge out for all organizations, including private sector, to ensure that they have 30% representation from unrepresented groups and 50% from women. So I think when you start seeing the boardrooms change their balance, those decisions will come faster. And I think it's a great challenge that the ICED put out there.
Yeah, interesting. We have a question about the carbon sequester technology from Neha in the audience. How feasible are they to administer?
To actually operate them? Is that the question?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, very feasible. I mean, it's so I just analogous to it's big technology for sure. It's simpler technology in the subsea floor than offshore oil and gas extraction, quite a bit simpler. But the systems are really very, very similar to what people have been using in the extractive industries to operate. So one of the good things about this is that people, the skills needed to operate these kind of technologies are the skills we have in the oil and gas sector. So it's a beautiful bridge to move from working in an extractive industry that hurts the planet to moving into a sustainable kind of technology.
That's awesome. Yeah, and definitely would seem aligned with those advocating for a just transition and secure jobs for everyone. So that's really interesting. Thank you. We also have a question from Eric in the audience. The IPCC will be releasing an updated report next week on their climate science or models. Is there anything that you're eagerly awaiting from the report or anticipating?
Well, I do think it'll be an update on what we know already. I think there has to be more emphasis on ensuring that there are social science solutions that help us move along this path faster. So I hope that becomes more stronger in the release. But these reports have been released for, I used to, when in the early days when I was talking about climate change, I used to wake up at 2 a.m. to go online and listen to the release of them. But you know, there's not been reduction in emissions. So I think that's what we need to see coming up, a way to really move along the reduction in emissions.
Totally. And like you mentioned, having an emphasis on the social science side of things of how are we going to do it, but how are we going to do it in a way that brings everyone along and is equitable? For
That's
sure.
right.
Yeah. There's a question from an anonymous audience member. How would you respond to folks who say new climate policies will negatively impact the economy?
They're wrong. I mean, you know, in order for us to do adaptation, it's an industry. In order to do mitigation, it's an industry. These are all industries. And so, and seeing Canada taking a lead in some ways, one of the most important ones is putting a big price on carbon. That means that it becomes an industry faster on all those fronts. So I think it's been shown in California that they're more advanced on all these climate actions, and it hasn't hurt their economy one bit. So it's a good example.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, all the training, if it's also similar, for example, for certain industries, then it's not like you're reinventing the wheel necessarily.
Right.
Yeah, totally.
Yes.
Joachim from the audience says, thanks for the great presentation. If we do all the currently available climate change mitigation, adaptation, when will things turn around, if they will?
Well, I think there's a lot of CO2. I showed in the beginning that CO2 stays in the atmosphere a long time. So we're going to have to be adapting for a long time because we have a lot of emissions already in the works. I have to say, I think it's going to be, it'll be toward the end of this century where we'll actually potentially see stabilization. But we'll have industries that help us adapt, and not only humans, but hopefully other species, and the way we farm and the way we gather food from the ocean.
Totally, yeah, very interconnected, and hopefully we're fingers crossed going to have an episode on regenerative ocean farming and touch on some of those topics later in the series for sure.
Of course, yes. I know you have the kelp in my background.
I noticed that. It's beautiful.
And what we're seeing is that the actual kelp forests are moving north, even because it's warming. So we might, you know, so there's a lot of impacts that are negative, but there can be positive aspects of climate change that we should not ignore.
We have another question pop up just now from somebody anonymous in the audience. It's a bit of a long one, so I can always repeat, but changing governments often leads to dropping the ball on climate action. In your opinion, and considering that we have only 8 years to reduce emissions to avoid a 1.5 degree warming and the impacts associated, do you think it would be valuable to have a referendum on climate action so that an independent body representing science and social science informs and directs policy? So yeah. I suppose the role is, would that be helpful?
Of course, that would be. I think what would be even more helpful would be having these targets legislated. And if they're not met, there's actual penalties, big penalties. And so I think we've got to start playing hardball, particularly with industry, but also governments need to give themselves those report cards and ensuring that they say we have this target, it's got to be met by a certain date. If it's not, these are the penalties associated with it.
Definitely. And then leading up to that, mini targets in between to make sure that we're actually staying accountable to those goals for sure. Yeah. This is one of the climate action recommendations that we actually have for this episode. The government of Canada just released a public feedback opportunity on their just transition plan. And so for audience members out there, this is your chance to go and take a look and see what is the plan at the federal level for a just transition, and does it align with what the science tells us? If not, maybe this is your time to actually have some input. And I know personally, when I was looking through their website, sometimes policy talk can be just as guilty as science talk of being full of complicated words and unnecessarily hindered down. But maybe if you have a buddy you want to read it with and talk out loud with, sometimes that can help. So that's one action that you can do today also in terms of public feedback to the government and holding them accountable.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. I'm just going to quickly so we have a question from Janet in the audience. And this relates a little bit to what you were saying of transferable skills from different industries. Do you speak with representatives from the oil industry? And if so, what are your goals with them? And do you have any strategies for speaking with them?
Well, yeah, we speak with mainly engineers who work at high levels in the services part of the oil and gas sector. And what we were always speaking with them to try to understand what technologies we could be moving in towards a more sustainable space. And when we started this project, they were very interested in sharing that knowledge to the level they could, because sometimes they're protected through intellectual property. But I have to say that it's turned around this year. There seems to be a sea change in leadership, that they really are looking at taking this like our technology and others much more seriously. So the conversations are rich, and I think they're going to get better and better as industry begins to take this responsibility on.
Interesting. What do you think led to that shift so recently?
Well, I think they're seeing that there's going to be carbon pricing coming. I also think that the fact that Exxon is no longer on the Dow, and that there's infiltration of activists into the shareholder groups who are acting. I think that there's been divestments. I think the discussion about stranded hydrocarbon assets is also, it's a whole range of these things that are coming together that are changing the picture.
That brings me hope. That's good to hear, especially because, I don't know that those conversations are happening, but you're definitely at the table for those. So that's really hopeful.
I'm not at the Exxon board table, but I just read about the activists that are now changing the game in some of these oil companies.
Totally. It's really encouraging to see also like creative strategies to engage different industries and public pressure and the role that can play in shaping legacy or legislation and shaping even what people think day to day.
Yeah, and I think it's important to grant even the worst industry members, grant them grace, because demonizing them won't get us anywhere. And so we really need to speak with kindness in terms of let's get everyone on the same page moving forward.
We have a question from Keith Whiten, who's the elected local government representative for the Alberni Clayoquot Regional District. Will Ocean Networks advocate for no new fossil fuel infrastructure in our coastal communities?
We aren't an advocacy group, but we are we're reducing our carbon footprint. We're working on solutions. I speak out about that personally because it's in my DNA. But certainly it doesn't make sense to invest in oil and gas infrastructure any longer. It's been that way for more than 10 years. So on a personal basis, I'll speak out about it, but we're a science organization, so we tend not to be an advocacy group. But I can tell you that most of our staff, a lot of us, they ride their bikes to work. We try to have the smallest footprint as possible, and so many of our staff are on their personal time advocates.
I do want to be mindful of the time, so we're going to transition to the conclusion for now, but thanks so much for this great conversation. And if there are any unanswered questions, we're going to try and get to them in the podcast, so stay tuned for that, coming this fall. But thanks so much for your time today, Dr. Moran, and for this engaging conversation. It's always great to hear from experts like you and to humanize this experience.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for inviting me.
And if you do know anyone everyone in the audience, if you know somebody who couldn't make it today, don't worry. This video will be archived on the Banfield Marine Sciences Center YouTube channel. And as I mentioned, stay tuned for the upcoming podcast this fall. And we wouldn't be a climate action webinar series if we didn't have some suggested actions for you. So just a little bit of a reminder, going back to the very start of our video, of our first action, how do you go beyond a territorial acknowledgement to learn about the traditional treaty or unceded land that you're on? Who has been inhabiting that land for generations and engaging in climate action, and how can you support them? The second one is to think about, okay, even if you're not by a coast, are you by a water body, a river, a lake? Who is already doing work to protect that ecosystem and the non-human and human beings there? So we'll have resources in the show notes for you to start your own journey of curiosity and to try and see who's already doing something, so you don't have to feel like you have to do this alone. And finally, as I mentioned in the conversation with Dr. Moran, there's an opportunity for public feedback on the Government of Canada's Just Transition Plan. So here's your chance to go and see what is the plan. Is there a plan, and does it align with what the science tells us and the timelines we have? And we'll offer some guiding questions for you, so stay tuned. Feel free to follow us on anywhere that you do social media. Our account is BMSC Climate, and share with us about what you learned today, what you'd like to see more of, and what your hopes are for the future. So that's it for the first BMSC Climate Action Series. Thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at our next episode on August 25th. So stay tuned.